Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I've worked the ski lifts at Crystal Peak Resort for almost 7 seasons now, and I can tell you most winters blend together into the same mix of cold mornings, impatient guests, and the low hum of the gondolas rolling over steel cables. The resort sits at 10,200 feet in the Colorado Rockies, tucked into a basin so remote that the only road in is a 2-lane mountain pass that snakes upward for 14 miles from the nearest town, Greenwich. There's no cell service past mile 7 unless you're on a ridgeline, and even the lodge's Wi-Fi cuts out in bad weather. That isolation is part of the appeal to the guests who pay thousands for a weekend here. No signal, no crowds, just snow, luxury, and altitude. It was early February, right after the X Games had wrapped up in Aspen, and the resort was booked solid. We had a mix of wealthy Denver regulars, a few European ski teams doing high-altitude training, and a corporate retreat from a tech company out of California. The forecast had been warning about a significant winter event for days, and we all knew what that meant. Big dump of snow, high winds, and, for the poor souls on my shift, a week of frozen fingers and running desing rounds on the lift towers. That Friday morning, the sky was a flat grey. The kind you know is holding back something heavy. Temperature was hovering at 9 degrees F, wind chill pushing it into the negatives on the upper slopes. I was stationed at Lift 4, the summit gondola, which runs from the mid-mountain lodge to the high ridge where most of the expert trails start. The cabins are enclosed, which is good for guests, but the system is older. Light and a Pommer, built in the late 90s and in high winds, it rocks just enough to make people uneasy. By noon, the wind had started picking up. You could feel the gusts pushing against the lift tower. Hear the cables humming under strain. Dispatch told us to run at half speed and be ready for a shutdown. I didn't mind. Slower pace meant fewer people boarding in a rush, and it gave me time to watch the storm wall creeping toward us from the west. That's when the first sign of trouble came through. Not on the radio, but from a guest. A ski instructor from one of the European teams brought a man down from the upper trails in a rescue sled. The guy was pale, sweating despite the cold, and mumbling in French. He couldn't stand without help. At first, everyone thought it was altitude sickness. It happens, especially when people fly in from sea level and head straight up here without acclimating. But something was off. His lips were cracked, not from the cold, but from biting them hard. His gloves were missing, and the skin on his hands was raw and red, like he'd been dragging them over something rough. The ski patrol loaded him into the snowcat to take him down to the medical station at the main lodge. That should have been the end of it. By 2:00 p.m., the visibility was dropping fast. The gondolas swayed harder with each gust, and management finally called for an early closure of the upper lifts. We started unloading the last riders, prepping to send the cabins down to the storage barn. I was just about to start my de-ice run when the radio lit up again. Medical requesting all available staff to assist in the dining hall. That was unusual. Normally, if something happened, they'd keep it in the first aid room. When I got there, it was chaos. About 24 guests were crammed into one end of the hall, voices overlapping in English, French, and German. The blizzard outside had slammed the big picture windows with snow so hard they looked frosted over. At the far end, I saw 3 of the kitchen staff holding someone down on the floor. It was another guest, one of the tech company guys. I recognized his neon green beanie. He was thrashing so violently that the wooden chairs around him had been knocked over. One of the chefs had a dish towel wrapped around his forearm, blood seeping through. And then I saw it. The man's mouth was wrong. His jaw moved too far when he snapped at the people holding him, like the tendons in his face had given way. His teeth were blood-stained, and his eyes, they didn't track like normal eyes. I'd seen drunk fights before, snowboarders brawling in bars, but this was different. The guy didn't seem to recognize where he was or who he was biting. Security managed to drag him toward the back exit, but he kept lunging forward, like his body was on a different program than his mind. They locked him in the storage pantry, then called the county sheriff's office. Dispatch said the storm had already closed the pass. No one was coming up until the plows could clear it. We tried to calm the guests, told them both cases were probably severe altitude reactions. The problem was, by 4:00 p.m., there were 3 more. One of the ski instructors, a woman named Sophia from Argentina, came in with a nosebleed that wouldn't stop. She kept shivering, even inside by the fireplace. And at one point she tried to drink from the pitcher directly, ignoring the glasses. When someone pulled it away from her, she hissed, not yelled, but actually hissed low in her throat. Then she collapsed. By 6:00 p.m., management had called an all-staff meeting in the conference room. Resort director, operations chief, head of ski patrol, head chef, and about 15 of us of floor staff. They told us straight. Medical didn't know what was happening, but the cases were escalating fast. The snowcats were grounded because of visibility. The gondola system was offline due to wind gusts hitting over 60 mph. The only way out was down the pass by snowmobile, and even that was suicide. In these conditions, we were to keep guests calm, restrict them to their rooms or the main hall, and keep anyone showing symptoms isolated in the storage area by the kitchens. That night, the wind howled like it was tearing at the walls. The generators kicked on twice when the main power flickered. Around midnight, I was making rounds with Pete, one of the older maintenance guys, checking doors and shutters. We passed by the storage pantry. The sound from inside, I still can't describe it. It wasn't shouting, it wasn't moaning, it was like a wet chewing noise over and over, slow and deliberate. Pete looked at me and said, "We're not opening that door, not tonight." By morning, we had 5 more altitude sickness cases. Only now some of them weren't moving like sick people. They were moving like hunters. Their posture had shifted, shoulders hunched forward, head tilted slightly, eyes scanning with a strange twitching focus. One of them, a man in a white ski jacket, stood perfectly still in the corner of the dining hall for nearly 10 minutes, ignoring people trying to talk to him, until suddenly he bolted toward the buffet table and shoved 2 trays of food onto the floor. When staff tried to pull him back, he didn't resist in a normal way. He twisted with sudden bursts of strength, muscles jerking unnaturally, his breath coming out in short, animal-like huffs. We had to force him into the storage area with the others. The storm outside had worsened overnight. Gusts slammed against the building hard enough to make the lodge's heavy timber beams creak. Snow accumulation was already over a foot, with the drifts piling higher against the windows. The 2-way radios were our only link to ski patrol posts, and even those were fading with interference. Cell towers in the valley were out entirely. Without outside help, the lodge was a sealed box high in the mountains, holding more than 80 guests and staff, with whatever this was spreading faster than we could isolate it. The head of ski patrol, Mark Delaney, took charge of containment. We moved the infected to a maintenance wing on the lower level. Concrete walls, steel fire doors, only one way in or out. The area had been used for equipment storage, so it was cold and empty. We dragged in a few cots, locked the door with a keyed latch, and posted 2 security staff nearby. Mark ordered us not to get too close, not to remove restraints once applied, and under no circumstances to let anyone inside without his clearance. He didn't call it a quarantine, but that's exactly what it was. The lodge itself was built like most luxury resorts. Central grade hall with massive stone fireplace, high vaulted ceilings, exposed timber trusses, and 2 wings of guest rooms branching out on either side. The kitchens and service areas were behind the dining hall, with narrow staff corridors connecting to the laundry boiler room and lower maintenance levels. The gondola terminal sat just outside, one connecting to the mid-mount lift and the other to the upper ridge. Both had been shut down and locked. Every outer door was secured with heavy deadbolts, not to keep people out, but now to keep them in. By midday, the first real violence happened. A German snowboarder, maybe 19 or 20, came stumbling into the Great Hall, calling for help in a hoarse voice. His jacket was torn, blood smeared across his chest, not from his own wound, but from someone else. Behind him came Sophia, the Argentine instructor who had collapsed the day before. She was moving faster than she had any right to, given the state she'd been in. Her eyes locked on the snowboarder's neck, like it was the only thing in the room. She hit him from behind, knocking both of them to the floor. And before anyone could react, her mouth was at his shoulder. The sound froze the entire room. It wasn't a scream or a shout. It was a deep, tearing noise followed by the snowboarder's choked cry. Two of us grabbed her, but her body jerked violently, flinging one of us backward into the hearth. It took 3 more to drag her off, and by the time we pulled the snowboarder away, he was unconscious and pale. We carried him to the first aid station, but he never woke up. His breathing slowed, then stopped within an hour. Management still refused to say what was happening. They told us not to spread panic, but the truth was already leaking into conversations between guests. Words like rabies and virus were whispered in the corners. Some said it was food poisoning. Others thought it was a reaction to altitude mixed with the dehydration. But those of us who had been close enough to see the change knew better. This wasn't altitude sickness, this wasn't the flu. Whatever it was turning people into something different, something that didn't care about pain or cold or reason. By late afternoon, we'd had to expand the locked section. The original maintenance wing couldn't hold them all, and putting more in meant keeping them in closer quarters. Something that worried me, but we had no choice. The infected didn't tire. They paced inside their confinement, their movements jerking and unpredictable, occasionally slamming into the steel door with enough force to rattle the frame. The chewing sounds from behind those doors never stopped, like they were working on an invisible meal. That evening, as the wind screamed outside, we lost power completely. The generators kicked in, but they could only support half the building at a time. Lights in the far wing went dark, and without central heating, the temperature started dropping. We had to move all the guests into the Great Hall for warmth. This brought everyone together, staff, family, ski teams, the corporate group sitting in tight clusters near the fire. It also made it harder to watch for symptoms. Around 9:00, the snowboarder's body, wrapped in a blanket and left in the first aid station because we had nowhere. Joe House started moving. I was on patrol with Pete again when we heard a thump from inside the station. We unlocked the door, thinking maybe someone had broken in. The snowboarder sat upright on the cot, eyes wide open but clouded over, skin pale and lips dry. He turned his head toward us with a slow, deliberate motion, then swung his legs down and stood. We backed away immediately, radios already up, but he moved toward us without a word. His gait was strange, uneven but fast, closing the space in sudden bursts. Pete grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a heavy ski boot, and slammed it into the snowboarder's head. It barely slowed him. We ran for the door, locking it behind us as he pounded against it with both hands. The banging didn't stop for the next hour. Outside, the storm still raged, cutting us off from everything. Inside, the infection was spreading, and our locked rooms were starting to feel like cages with the bars facing the wrong way. The wind pressed snow against the walls until its sea led half the windows with white. The main doors had to be shoveled out every hour just to prevent them from freezing shut entirely. But even then, there was nowhere to go. The road down the mountain was buried under at least 4 feet of powder, with the drifts much higher where the gust had funneled snow between the trees. No snowcat could make that descent now, not without rolling off into a ravine. The infected were becoming more difficult to contain. Even behind the steel doors of the maintenance wing, they threw themselves against the frame, sometimes in unison as if sensing each other's intent. The sound was unnerving, a deep metallic boom followed by the scrape of limbs against the floor. We posted guards there in shifts, but no one lasted long. The smell alone, a mixture of sweat, blood, and something sour that clung to the air, was enough to drive people away. With the generator already under strain, Mark ordered the infected area left unheated to conserve fuel. We thought maybe the cold would slow them. It didn't. If anything, their movements became even more erratic, as though the drop in temperature made them agitated rather than weak. Guests noticed the pounding from below and began asking why certain areas were off limits. Management continued to give vague answers, but the truth had already started leaking through from staff who couldn't keep their voices down during tense moments. Fear spread faster than any official announcement could have managed. On the second night of the lockdown, the Great Hall felt like a crowded lifeboat. Every bench, couch, and carpeted section of floor was taken. The fire roared in the hearth, but the cold seeped in from the darkened wings. People tried to sleep in shifts, though few managed more than an hour at a time before the sound of distant banging or a muffled scream brought them back to full alertness. The lodge had been built for luxury, not siege conditions. There were too many doors, too many windows, too many narrow service corridors that snaked behind walls like veins in a body we no longer trusted. That night, just before midnight, the first real breach happened. The pounding from the maintenance wing stopped abruptly. The guards, 2 members of the kitchen staff who had been roped into the role, stepped closer, probably thinking the infected had finally collapsed. One leaned in to listen. That's when the door frame shook with such force it bent the latch plate inward. The top hinge snapped. Something heavy slammed again, and the door gave way. By the time the radio call went out, 3 figures had already spilled into the corridor. 2 men and a woman, all guests who had been locked up the day before. Their skin was ashen, lips split from the cold, eyes wide and glassy. They moved in bursts, quick, almost weightless steps, followed by a moment of stillness before lunging again. The guards tried to hold them back, but in seconds they were overwhelmed. One was dragged down, his cries muffled instantly. The other ran, slipping on the tile as the infected sprinted after him. Mark and 2 ski patrol members intercepted them near the boiler room. One swung a fire axe, catching the first infected across the temple. The body fell, but the legs kept twitching, scraping against the floor like they hadn't received the message. The other 2 were forced back into the hallway with a combination of blunt strikes and sheer pushing. Then the surviving guard slammed the service door and wedged a steel pry bar through the handles. It wouldn't hold long. After that, containment was impossible. The infected were no longer isolated to a single area. They were somewhere in the building, slipping between dark corridors and unlit rooms. We could hear them occasionally, a soft, fast scuttle of feet over wooden floors, a door creaking open without anyone near it, the faint sound of breathing where there shouldn't have been any. Guests started keeping improvised weapons close, ski poles, heavy candlesticks from the fireplace mantels, even the iron poker from the great hall hearth. The resort's veneer of calm had been stripped away entirely. The cold was creeping in faster now. The generator could only run one wing's heating system at a time, and with the infected free, we couldn't risk sending anyone to fix the main power in the utility shed outside. The thought of opening those doors into a whiteout with visibility less than 10 feet was suicide enough. But the idea of wandering into the blizzard while something that didn't seem to feel the cold could be out there was worse. On the third morning, the storm reached its peak. The wind speed at the summit was reported at over 90 mph, and at our elevation, it was still strong enough to sandblast exposed skin with snow crystals. The main lodge groaned under the pressure, and ice formed along the inside of the upper windows. From one of the higher stairwell landings, I could barely make out the gondola towers swaying in the gale, cables vibrating like a drawn bowstring. We had fewer people in the Great Hall that day, and it took me a while to realize why. Some hadn't come down from their rooms overnight. A few staff were sent to check, but in more than one case, doors were found open with no one inside. Whether they'd wandered off on their own or been taken in the night, we didn't know. But the empty spaces left behind were just more proof that we were losing ground inside the lodge itself. By that night, we stopped patrolling entirely. It wasn't safe to walk the halls in pairs anymore. Too many blind corners, too many shadowed recesses. The infected didn't seem to rest. They didn't need light. And they moved so quietly at times that they could be on you before you even heard the first step. We began dragging furniture to block entrances to the Great Hall, forming a crude barricade. The sound of chairs and tables scraping over hardwood became the new background noise, replacing the low murmur of uneasy conversation. The storm still had another day in it, according to the last weather update before the radio signal failed entirely. We didn't know if the road would be cleared after that. We didn't know if anyone outside even realized how bad it had gotten here. And with each passing hour, the building felt smaller. Not because the walls were closing in, but because the number of safe places you could stand without your back exposed was shrinking fast. By the time night settled in, the Great Hall felt less like a safe zone and more like a last stand. Every entryway had been barricaded with furniture, luggage carts, and anything heavy enough to block a doorway. The infected still hadn't tried to force their way in, but we knew they were out there. Sometimes we'd hear them brushing against the barricades, the soft thud of a shoulder or a slow dragging of fingers over the wood. Once a head appeared briefly in the narrow gap above a boarded-up window, eyes dull but alert, breath fogging the glass. It stayed just long enough for us to be certain we'd seen it before vanishing into the shadows outside. The cold was beginning to win. Even with the fire in the hearth burning day and night, the temperature inside had dropped into the low 40s. People huddled under blankets or slept in their coats, but no one really slept for long. Every sound was a potential warning. The crack of settling timber could be mistaken for footsteps. The hiss of wind through a loose shutter sounded too much like breathing. Sometime after midnight, the lodge shifted. It wasn't the usual creak of the beams or the groan of ice. It was sharper, like something structural had been hit. The noise came again, closer this time, and then the barricade at the far end of the hall shuttered. Chairs scraped against the floor as they shifted under pressure. A moment later, the sound of wood splintering cut through the room. We grabbed what we had, ski poles, fire pokers, even the heavy iron lid from the soup kettle, and rushed to hold the barricade in place. The first impact sent one of the luggage carts rolling backward, its wheels squealing. Something slammed against the doorway again, harder, and this time a chair leg snapped. A hand came through the gap, skin white with cold, fingernails cracked and rimmed with dark crust. It clawed at the wood with mechanical persistence, not even flinching when a staff member smashed it with a poker. The gap widened, and then they came. They didn't scream or roar, they just surged forward with sudden explosive speed. The first two were knocked down, but the third vaulted over the barricade entirely, landing in the middle of the room and scattering those closest to the fire. Chaos erupted. People tripped over each other in the rush to get away. One of the ski patrols swung an axe into the attacker's chest, but it didn't stop moving until a second blow caught it in the neck. Even then, the body convulsed on the floor, twitching violently before going still. The breach brought more. They poured through the gap, some still in torn ski jackets and boots, others barefoot despite the cold, their movements sharp and unpredictable. They were fast, faster than any of us expected. The fight spilled across the great hall, knocking over benches and scattering embers from the fireplace. The smell of burned fabric mixed with the metallic tang of blood in the air. I don't remember making the decision to run, but suddenly I was moving, grabbing Pete by the sleeve and pulling him toward the staff corridor that led to the kitchens. Behind us, the barricade collapsed completely. The firelight flickered wildly as shadows moved in ways that didn't match the number of bodies still standing. We sprinted through the narrow halls, the cold air cutting into our lungs. In the kitchen, we slammed the double doors shut and shoved a metal prep table in front of them. It wouldn't hold for long, but it gave us a moment to think. There were maybe 8 of us in the room. Staff, a couple of guests, and Mark, who had taken a cut to the arm, but was still on his feet. He looked at us and said only one thing. "We can't stay here." The only possible escape was through the service entrance at the rear of the kitchen, which led out to the loading dock. From there, it was a short path to the snowcat shed. If we could get one running, we could try for the road. The idea was madness in this weather, but staying meant dying in the next hour. We pushed through the door and into the night. The storm was still raging, but the wind had shifted enough to thin the whiteout. Shapes loomed in the darkness, trees, snowbanks, the outline of the gondola terminal swaying in the gusts. The cold was instant and brutal, burning any exposed skin. Snow was up to our thighs in places, slowing every step. Halfway to the shed, the sound of movement cut through the wind, not the slow crunch of snow under oats, but the rapid, uneven strides we'd come to dread. Figures emerged from the storm, their outlines ragged, heads low. They moved without hesitation, their speed unbroken by the drifts. We didn't have the barricades or the walls now. It was open ground, and they were faster. Mark fired the flare gun he'd grabbed from the patrol office. The burst of red light lit the snow in a bloody glow, revealing a half-dozen of them closing in. Their faces were slack, eyes fixed, breath clouding the air in quick bursts. The flare arced into the distance, hissing as it fell, and for a moment they slowed, heads turning toward it. We used that moment to reach the shed. Inside, a smell of fuel and cold metal was a shock after the wind. The snowats were lined up in the gloom, their engines silent. We piled into the nearest one while Pete fumbled with the ignition. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. Outside, the shapes were gathering again, drawn by the noise. Mark threw the lever, and the machine lurched forward, treads biting into the snow. We didn't look back at the lodge. The last thing I saw of it was the glow of the firelight flickering in the great hall windows, shadows moving inside in a way that made it hard to tell where the people ended and the infected began. The descent down the path was slow and dangerous. The snowcat's lights barely pierced the swirling snow, and more than once we had to swerve to avoid drifts taller than the machine itself. Somewhere along the way, the wind died down and the sky began to lighten. Dawn was breaking over the mountains, turning the peaks a pale, frozen blue. When we finally saw the first snowplow clearing the road below, relief hit like a wave. But it was short-lived. Even from a distance, we could see movement near the plow, figures climbing over its hood, the driver's door hanging open. At first, I thought maybe it was some rounded motorist helping the crew dig it out. But the way they moved, fast, jerking, low to the ground at times, killed that hope in seconds. One of them was halfway inside the cab, legs kicking as he forced himself in against the driver. The others surrounded the plow, their hands smearing dark streaks over the white paint. Pete swore under his breath, throttling back before they could hear the engine. The snowcat idled at the shoulder of the pass, engine rumbling low, while we stared down at the scene. The driver was still moving, struggling in his seat, but it was a useless fight. The man halfway inside convulsed once, then pulled himself back out, his face and hands a mess of fresh red that steamed in the cold air. The driver slumped against the steering wheel, horn blaring in a long broken note that carried up the valley. Every infected head turned toward it at once. We didn't stick around. Pete eased the machine back into gear, taking a different cut down the slope toward a service spur that connected to the county road farther south. It wasn't a real escape route, just a maintenance track used in summer for hauling supplies, but it was the only way to avoid passing within 20 yards of that plow. The treads bit into the fresh snow, the whole cabin shuddering over uneven drifts, and all the while I kept watching the tree line for movement. Half a mile down, we caught sight of it. Not a single group this time, but scattered figures moving in parallel to us through the forest, keeping pace despite the terrain. Some ran for a few seconds, then stopped suddenly, heads turning as though listening for something. Others moved with a strange, tireless march, their feet never seeming to sink into the snow as deeply as ours. Every so often, one would break off from the rest and vanish behind a rock outcrop, only to reappear closer a few minutes later. Mark leaned forward in his seat, his bandaged arm tucked close to his chest. "They're tracking the sound," he muttered. He wasn't wrong. Even with the storm gone, the snowcat's engine was the loudest thing for miles. Out here, it was a beacon. We passed the last bend before the service track joined the lower road, only to find it buried under a drift taller than the cab. No way through. Pete killed the engine instantly, plunging us into a silence broken only by our breathing and the faint creak of cooling metal. We sat there for a long moment, the cold seeping into our boots, each of us scanning the woods for the shapes we knew were coming. It was Mark who made the call. "We go on foot south to the ranger station. If the road's blocked here, they'll have equipment there." He said it with the flat certainty of someone used to giving orders, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The station was at least 2 miles away, and between here and there was open snow and dense timber. Plenty of places to get cut off. Still, staying with the cat was suicide. It was a steel trap, if they reached us. We packed fast, spare fuel, what food we could carry, the flare gun, a small hatchet from the emergency kit. I slung a coil of climbing rope over my shoulder, more for the reassurance of having something than any real plan to use it. Then we stepped down into snow that came up to our knees. The sudden quiet pressing in from all sides. The first 100 yards were clear, then I heard it, a faint crunch behind us, slow but deliberate. I glanced back and caught sight of a figure just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't running, it was standing still, head cocked slightly, watching us. When it moved again, it was in a short, sharp burst, closing 10 feet in the blink of an eye, before freezing in place again. Another shape appeared farther left, mirroring the first. The timber line narrowed ahead, forcing us into a natural choke point between two steep ridges. The snow was deeper there, slowing us to a crawl. My legs burned, lungs aching in the thin air. but I didn't dare stop. Every few steps I looked back, and every time they were closer, never quite running, never making a sound beyond the soft crush of snow underfoot. We made it to the Argiline just as the light began to fade again. The sky over the peaks turned a bruised purple, the kind of mountain dusk that seems to last only minutes before full dark. Somewhere below us, in the direction of the ranger station, a light flickered, steady, artificial. It could have been the station security lamp, or it could have been something else entirely. Pete reached the crest first, turning to pull the rest of us up the last slope. That's when the shapes broke from the trees entirely, moving faster than before, no longer pretending to pace us. The last stretch to the ridge became a scramble, boots sliding, hands clawing at loose snow. Behind us, they closed, hit the gap in seconds. I don't remember the moment we hit the far side, just the shock of stumbling into deep powder, the sound of someone shouting ahead, and the sudden glare of a flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Voices called out from below, sharp and urgent. Then came the crack of a rifle shot echoing off the ridge, and one of the shapes behind us dropped face first into the snow. It wasn't rescue, not yet, but it was the first sign we weren't alone on this mountain. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepy pastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.